Who's the stupidest person you've ever met? And what story perfectly sums up their stupidity? Story 1. My brother and I were in the kitchen one day as teenagers. He was filling the sink to wash dishes. When the sink was nearly full, he went to turn the tap off, but it wouldn't budge, so the water kept flowing. I tried turning it too, but with no success. That's when the panic set in. The level of water was rising fast, and we didn't want to flood the kitchen. He grabbed big saucepans from the cupboard to fill with water to prevent it from overflowing, while I frantically scrambled under the sink, trying to find the main water valve to shut it off there. I couldn't find it. Now, really panicking, I took over the pot-filling duty while my brother ran off to find Dad as quickly as he could. Dad came running in with my brother while we were shouting at him about finding the main valve. Without saying a word, Dad walked over to the sink and pulled the plug out of the drain, letting all the water flow out. Ha ha! Story 2. My cousin. Throughout public school, she was a snob who looked down on everyone. She was always super stylish, but struggled academically. We graduated in 2014 and went to different colleges. She got a job at a bar and stayed out late drinking. Her boyfriend convinced her she didn't need to finish college, so she just stopped showing up. She didn't officially withdraw. She just stopped going and flunked out completely. Here comes the absurd part. Our families lived hours away from her college at the time. When her family went to move her back home, her mom noticed a pile of clothes in the corner and asked, "What's that, your laundry? Pack it and we'll wash it when we get home later." My cousin, I kid you not, replied, "You can wash those?" It turns out she'd been throwing away her clothes instead of washing them. She claimed she didn't know they could be washed, though she managed to wash her undergarments and bras just fine. Now back home with her family, she started doing more chores to show she's becoming more responsible, yet she still tries to throw clothes away sometimes, insisting she didn't know they could be washed and reused. It makes me wonder what she thought all those years before college, back when she lived at home. She wore the same outfits repeatedly. She had to have known they could be washed. Story 3. When I was in the Navy, there was a cook on my ship who once served rare chicken. I genuinely couldn't tell if he was trying to hide his limitless incompetence or if he actually believed rare poultry was a thing. Honestly, he was dumb enough to believe it. Another time, he filled a pan with ground beef and called it meatloaf. On yet another occasion, he was supposed to bake sugar cookies, several hundred of them for the whole crew. However, he didn't bother reading the label on the container he opened. Apparently, he also didn't taste the batter at any point because he ended up making salt cookies. He used up all the remaining salt in the pantry, leaving us with unseasoned food for the rest of the mission. After that, the captain assigned someone to act as the cook's bodyguard. Story 4. I had a next-door neighbor who once robbed a Howard Johnson's at the top of our street at gunpoint while wearing a ski mask. He took the money, removed the mask, and started walking home, just 2 blocks down the same street. The cops pulled him over, found the mask, the gun, and the money. He was completely wasted and asked them, "Would it help if I said I'm sorry?" He got a couple of years in Rikers Island for that. After getting out, he broke into a local apartment building, stole some money and jewelry, and then got stuck out on the fire escape when the ladder wouldn't go down and the window behind him was closed. That earned him a couple more years. That's 2 stories, I guess, but there's more. Still, you get the picture. Before he went away one time, he left me a box of cassettes, including the Allman Brothers live at the Fillmore. I became a lifelong fan, so thanks, unnamed next-door failed robber. He was actually a really nice guy, and he looked like a young Ray Liotta, just dumb as a brick. Story 5. A guy I worked with named Buddy bought a huge Snap-on roll-away toolbox for over $3,000 on credit. 2 days later, he sold it to a coworker for $1,500 because he had some overdue bills to pay. Needless to say, he never paid Snap-on for the toolbox. After he got fired for starting his 4th fistfight at work, he vanished. One of my other coworkers told the Snap-on salesman where Buddy's new job was, and last we heard, they were garnishing his wages. Buddy was a nutcase. He had very thin skin, and the smallest thing would set him off. When he did snap, he went absolutely ballistic. He once yelled at a security guard and threatened to have him fired just because he didn't like the guard's tone. He almost got fired 3 times for fighting, but managed to win over the department manager each time, until the 4th incident. Oh, and one time he was asked to put caution tape across a malfunctioning gate. His response? I don't know how. Story 6. I once called an Uber driver. When he arrived, he immediately asked me, "Are you going to X location?" I said no. He replied, "Great, because I'm not going to take you to X location." "Fine," I said. And we got underway. But my curiosity got the better of me, so I asked, "Hey, what would you have done if I had said that I wanted to go to X location?" He responded, "Look, man, I'm not going to take you to X location, okay? I told you already." I tried to clarify. No, I don't want to go there. You already know where I want to go. It's on your destination map. I'm just curious. What if I had wanted to go to X location? Would you have refused me the trip? Driven off? He said, "Look, man, I can't change the trip now. And anyway, I already told you I refused to go to X location. You got to understand I'm busy." We spent nearly 15 minutes in variations of this back and forth. He was a fluent English speaker, by the way. By the end of it, I was completely convinced he couldn't comprehend the syntax of a hypothetical. He literally couldn't process the question. If X situation, which is not the case, then what would you do? I wasn't even mad, just astonished. How had he navigated through life this far? What were his financial decisions like? I really wanted to follow him home and make a reality TV show about him. Story 7. I knew a guy in high school who thought his practical jokes were hilarious. His jokes were just designed to piss people off, and he thought their angry reactions were funny. You'd be right to think he was a jerk, but he was also incredibly stupid. Every time someone told him, "Dude, stop with the nonsense," he'd blow it off. One day, he knocked a kid's hat off his head. The kid picked it up and told him to knock it off. The guy smacked the hat off again. The kid warned him, "Do it a third time and I'll knock you out." Pranker, with a smug grin, knocked the hat off again and got clocked in the face so hard he didn't know what hit him. All he could say was, "What the hell, man? Chill out." But no one wanted to hear him out. Story 8. There's always that guy in the military, the one you try to help but realize it's a lost cause. That guy was a walking disaster. The first time I met him, I found his weapon in a porta potty. I walked out with his weapon in mine, handed it to a sergeant, and discovered it was his squad leader. 10 minutes later, I saw him doing rifle PT in full battle gear with a sign around his neck that said, "I forgot my weapon in the shitter. Don't be like me. I'm a dumbass." This wasn't the only time he lost his weapon or gear. He was transferred to another battalion but got sent back for refusing to cut his hair and follow orders. While deployed, he once yelled in the chow hall, "You don't see a D in my P," because his ex-wife was dating other men. Later, he threatened to shoot people in his squad, so his weapon was confiscated. Not long after, he was caught masturbating to Family Guy. When he became my driver, things didn't get better. He wasn't allowed to drink because he'd get white girl wasted and overdramatic. Once, he threatened to turn himself into the sheriff instead of reporting for duty because a girl rejected him. When I told him to go ahead, he sobbed, saying it was my job as his sergeant to fix his problems. He also claimed to be a webcam model and assured us he was showing his dingy only to women because, you can tell. Spoiler, he wasn't. Before going to the field for 2 weeks, he removed all his clean uniforms from his bags, leaving with just the clothes on his back. By day 3, his stench was unbearable. On top of that, he would constantly masturbate in the driver's hatch. His advice to everyone? Scam the VA, collect food stamps, and put your name on class action lawsuits. He believed the Army owed him sergeant stripes because he'd been in for 9 years. Eventually, I got him to leave the Army. He's now scamming $2,600 a month off assistance programs. Whenever people get mad about it, I ask, "Do you really want that guy in the workforce?" It's better for everyone that he's not. Story 9. I worked with a man named Roy who had his own theories about life, which he called Royconomics. One day, he turned to me and another crew member and said, "You boys want to know how to get nice things? You go to the store and finance everything. Furniture, appliances, TVs, stereos, everything. Then you don't make any payments and don't show up for your court date. They'll garnish your wages, but they take way less than the payments would have been." A week later, he shared his method for buying a house. Apply for every credit card you can get. Take out the maximum cash advance from all of them and use that for your down payment. Then don't make any payments and don't show up for your court date. For those wondering, I last saw Roy about 10 years ago. He was in his early 50s, rocking a gray-blonde skullet and living in a hamlet in Saskatchewan. Story 10. I have a friend who's constantly pursued by debt collectors for small unpaid bills, electricity, banks, credit cards, you name it. They've seemingly given up on him. He's won, but at the cost of a ruined credit score, no savings, no pension, near unemployment, and a young family to support. He also believes the Earth is flat. His reasoning? Rockets can't work in space because there's no air to push against. The sun is only 6,000 miles away, and the atmosphere must be in a pressure vessel, or it would float away. He knows this because he took mechanics in school. One day he jumped up and down and said, "The Earth is rotating?" Then why isn't it moving under my feet? At that point, I wished it had, and taken me with it. This same friend told me my new car wasn't a real model name because they only call it that because it's close to the ground. He also thinks computers will learn tasks by playing YouTube videos in their brains and plans to find Tesla's lost blueprints to invent something in his backyard. The man can't even put up a bookshelf. He could prove the earth is flat, but he's too busy taking his daughter swimming on Sundays. Story 11. My in-laws visited us recently and stayed at an Airbnb nearby because our place is too small. And frankly, my MIL drives me nuts. When I went to pick them up, Emil managed to turn the short walk to my car into an ordeal. She stopped to examine a squashed piece of metal in the street, claiming it looked like a frog. She and Fiel stood there in the middle of the road, discussing this dirty blob while I tried to usher them onward. Finally, she moved, but then tried to open the door of a black car parked near me. My car is silver, and she'd been in it many times. She even asked why I was standing next to the wrong car. When we reached my car, which was parked on a narrow, busy street, they held up traffic as they searched for something to wrap the frog in. Cars were honking, and I was practically begging them to hurry up. Once they were finally in, Mill joked, "You're talking to us like we're your 2-year-old son." No, my son is far more cooperative. Story 12. In my third-year chemistry course, we worked with titanium-4, chloride, TiTl4, an extremely dangerous substance. It reacts violently with water, producing hydrochloric acid in dense white clouds. Due to its volatility, strict precautions were required. Gloves, special containers, and handling only inside a fume hood. One guy ignored all the warnings and opened the bottle at his workstation. Immediately, billows of white smoke began rising, and he started choking. Instead of screwing the lid back on, he panicked and threw the bottle on the floor. The spill vaporized rapidly, filling the room with poisonous gas and acid. The entire building had to be evacuated. Even a week later, the lab still smelled of hydrochloric acid. That student never returned to the course. I can only assume he was expelled. Story 13. A friend from college had plenty of clueless moments, but the best was the time she thought she might be pregnant after hooking up with a guy. They hadn't had sex. He'd only fingered her. But she convinced herself he might have had sperm on his hands, and somehow it got inside her. She speculated that he might have been masturbating before he touched her, even though she hadn't seen anything. She panicked so much that she went to get the morning after pill. Worried about the side effects, she decided to confess the entire story to her parents, for reasons I still don't understand. This, of course, led to a long lecture on promiscuity. The kicker? She was studying to be a science teacher, and now she's employed as one. Story 14. I used to work with a French-Italian guy who was the epitome of illogical thinking. He was anti-vaccine, believed in government conspiracies, and swore by homeopathy. One of his favorite cures was clay, which he thought had supernatural healing powers. When he and his wife lived in Denmark, they couldn't enroll their son in kindergarten without basic vaccinations. So they reluctantly got the boy vaccinated. However, as soon as they left the doctor's office, this man peeled off the bandage and slapped a lump of clay on his son's arm. He believed the clay would suck the vaccine out of the boy's veins. In his mind, he had successfully unvaccinated his son and outsmarted the government. Ironically, his stupidity ensured his son got the vaccines he needed, despite his father's insanity. Story 15. I worked with a kid at a movie theater who was utterly clueless. He claimed he could see the future and once said he had a premonition that we'd bring back the old Coke machines. Those machines didn't even exist anymore. They had been scrapped for parts. He was a big fan of cosplay and thought he had started a trend when Justice League premiered, even though there were only about 6 cosplayers in the theater. On his first day of orientation, he showed up at 10 p.m. instead of 5 p.m. He lived across town and had walked to work. When asked why he didn't leave earlier if he knew he was walking, his reply was, "I didn't think of that." That same week, he took a 15-minute break and disappeared for 2 hours. When my coworker found him, he said, "The line at Subway was really long." He also confidently told us that the original Jumanji movie was supposed to be about a video game, but since video games hadn't been invented yet, they scrapped the idea. I sometimes think he believed the world didn't exist before he was born. Story 16. I once lifeguarded at a frat party despite warnings from friends not to take the gig. The pay was good, and I just renewed my certification, so I figured, how bad could it be? Answer, terrible. One very drunk guy approached me while I was guarding the pool and offered me a drink. I declined, but he kept coming back. At one point, he smashed a full, unopened beer can against his head, screamed "woo!" and started bleeding profusely. Instead of realizing his mistake, he got even more hyped up, dove headfirst into the murky 6-foot pool, and nearly broke his neck. I blew my whistle at him repeatedly, trying to stop his reckless behavior. When he climbed out of the pool, he couldn't understand why I was upset and started flirting with me mid-conversation. Then he realized he'd lost his Ray-Bans in the pool and demanded I drain it to find them. This guy was a non-stop source of idiocy for the entire 3 hours, cheered on by his equally foolish friends. Would not recommend lifeguarding a frat party. Story 17. I was leasing an apartment when my landlord called and told me I needed to move out immediately because his cousin was coming to town and needed the place. I reminded him that I had a signed lease with 6 months left, and that was his problem to figure out, not mine. A few days later, the cousin showed up unannounced with a key and let himself in. He aggressively demanded that I leave, but I told him to get lost or I'd call the cops. After some yelling, he left, but not without a tantrum. I immediately had the locks changed. A couple of days later, the cousin kicked in a window and broke into the apartment. I was there at the time, and as soon as I heard the banging, I called 911. When he got inside, he grabbed the phone from me mid-call and started yelling at the operator. I told him, "This is going to go great for you when the cops show up and see you holding my phone in a broken apartment." He eventually put the phone down and I snatched it back. We had a shouting match, but I refused to leave. Then he decided to call the cops on me. I thanked him, pointing out that 911 calls from the same place would speed things up. His girlfriend, or sister, was with him and my girlfriend was with me. They started their own argument, and suddenly we had 4 calls to 911 in progress. When the cops arrived, 6 or 8 of them, they came in with guns drawn and arrested both the cousin and his girlfriend. The cousin kept yelling that his uncle said he could live there, as if that would help. The girl just looked like she'd been dragged into this nonsense one too many times. After showing the cops my lease and ID, I never heard from them or the landlord again. A short while later, the landlord shut off the power and water. I talked to a lawyer about my rights, but with no heat or running water in the middle of winter, a broken window, and a damaged door, I decided to move out as quickly as possible. I didn't pay rent for the last month, didn't clean, and left the fridge full of rotting food. The smell of spoiled turkey was my little parting gift. So, Story 18. I went to school with a kid named Aaron whose stupidity was legendary. On a trip to the zoo, Aaron got into an argument with a zookeeper because he thought tigers were female lions. The zookeeper, an expert on tigers, eventually walked away, and Aaron took this as a victory. But the best story happened in science class. Our usual teacher was out getting shoulder surgery, so we had a substitute, a non-religious Arab woman. Aaron was also a massive racist. As soon as she walked in, Aaron quipped that the bomb-making class was down the hall. She warned him to stop, but Aaron being Aaron, he didn't. 10 minutes into the lesson, while the substitute was pouring a dangerous chemical mixture, Aaron suddenly screamed, "Bomb!" Startling her, she spilled the chemicals. They started smoking, so she pulled the emergency lever and evacuated the class. Aaron was expelled shortly after, his 3rd expulsion in 3 years. It turned out the substitute teacher was married to the vice principal, which only sealed his fate. His parents tried every school in the area, but no one would take him. I sometimes wonder if he ever achieved his dream of becoming the world's best police officer. Something tells me probably not. Story 19. An ex-friend of mine was a rather unorthodox Bible-thumping Christian. She didn't quote scriptures or condemn everyone to hell, but her behavior was bizarre. One time I brought out a deck of tarot cards and she freaked out, screaming at me to put them away. Another time I mentioned how I was once misdiagnosed with meningitis when I actually had migraines, and she went on a rant about how modern medicine is wrong, insisting that prayer and home remedies are the only true cures. Her family wasn't much better. After her younger brother had a scare in the hospital, she and her equally clueless mother tried to sue the doctor who treated him. The doctor had suspected the mumps, ran tests, and referred him to another hospital just in case. It turned out he only had an infection, but they were outraged that the doctor had thought it might be mumps. They asked my mother to help with their case, but when they saw the legal fees and were told by a lawyer that their claim had no merit, they dropped it. Haven't seen her or her family since, and I can't say I miss them. Story 20. In university, I knew a guy named Rob who was academically brilliant but had zero common sense. He could ace exams but stumbled through life in the most ridiculous ways. One time, Rob lost a small notebook he used to jot down ideas, poems, and notes for a screenplay he was drafting. He dropped it while running for a bus and didn't realize it was gone until he got home. Luckily, someone found it and texted him using the contact information written inside. However, the notebook also had a section labeled "Reward if Found," where, as a joke, Rob had written £100. The old man who found it demanded the reward money or refused to return the notebook. Rob tried to explain it was a joke and that he couldn't afford £100 as a broke student, but the man wouldn't budge. Rob's friends, including me, told him it was insane to pay that much for a notebook. Instead, we suggested he bring the man a bottle of wine as a thank you gesture and stand firm on not paying the money. When Rob went to collect the notebook, the old man refused the wine because he didn't drink and insisted on the cash. Rob, now trapped in this bizarre situation of his own making, ended up compromising and paid the guy £50 just to escape. The cherry on top? On the way home, the bottle of wine broke in Rob's backpack, soaking and destroying both the notebook and his phone. Story 21. My current roommate is not the easiest person to live with. He's loud at the worst times, doesn't clean, and his social skills leave a lot to be desired. But his most baffling trait is how proficient he is at losing things. Since I've known him, he's lost his phone multiple times and is now on his second one. His student ID has gone missing so many times that he recently got a second one as a backup. Within 2 days, he'd managed to lose both of them. The most absurd example, though, was when he lost his bike. On our campus, bike thefts are pretty common, so when he couldn't find his bike one morning, he assumed it had been stolen. He filed a police report and bought a new bike. Weeks later, he came into the room overjoyed, claiming he'd found his bike. It was parked at the dorm next door, just 50 feet from where he normally locked it. He called the officer handling the case to report that it had been found. When asked where, he replied, "At the dorm next to ours. It's weird, though. The thief must have used my lock to secure it again. Why would they do that?" Story 22. Back in the pre-cell phone era, I worked in a machine shop with mostly male coworkers. One day, some of them invited me to go camping, and since I enjoy camping and boating, I decided to join. Everyone drove separately except for one guy, let's call him Dumas. His car broke down on the highway just a few miles from home while towing his boat. Instead of going back to fix his car, he convinced a good Samaritan to tow his boat to the lake for him, leaving his car stranded on the highway. Once at the campsite, he repeatedly blamed his car trouble on my presence, saying, "It's just like having a woman on a boat." He brought this up endlessly, even when I wasn't on his boat. At dusk, everyone started turning on their boat's lights, but Dumas didn't have any. He borrowed a flashlight from our supervisor to strap onto his boat. Of course, he promptly dropped it into the water. Cue more comments about women on boats. By nightfall, I had enough and opted to sleep on the supervisor's boat to avoid Dumas's idiocy. The next morning, I heard about all the chaos I missed. Dumas, trying to return to camp in the dark, landed his boat a mile downshore and wandered around looking for the site. When he eventually made it back, he sat drinking with the group until the early hours, all while continuing to complain about me being there. At some point, he pulled out a gun and fired a few rounds into the sky before being convinced to stop. Instead of bringing a tent, he'd packed a few blankets and laid them near the campfire. Naturally, the blankets caught fire in the middle of the night. The next day, as we were packing up to leave, Dumas asked if I could tow his boat. When I declined, he then asked if I could at least drive him back to his apartment. Everyone else had already bailed on him, so I grudgingly agreed, but only because I wanted to get out of there without another scene. Story 23. I love my mom, but technology is not her strong suit. A few months ago, she called me asking if I could go home, log into the house computer, open her email, and send some paperwork or pictures to my aunt, whom she was visiting. When I asked why she didn't just log into her email on my aunt's computer, she said, "How the hell am I supposed to do that? It's on my house computer." I tried explaining how email works, but she got angrier, accusing me of being the stupid one. Eventually, I called my dad, a tech geek, and asked him to explain it to her. He ended up emailing the documents himself. Another time, she insisted my brother's cat was featured in a viral video he'd shared on Facebook. I explained it wasn't his cat, just a funny video he liked, but she scoffed. Why would he film someone else's cat? Stupid girl, it's his cat. And then there's her spreadsheet. She's been tracking lotto numbers for years, convinced she'll uncover a pattern to win the jackpot. We tease her about it, so she's promised we won't get a share when she cracks the code. Story 24. There was a guy in high school we'll call Tony. He dropped out just a few months before graduating to work at a weld shop where his brother also worked. To be fair, $18 an hour was decent money for an 18-year-old. However, Tony didn't handle his finances well. Weeks after starting the job, he bought a $60,000 truck, with payments greater than his income. To cover the difference, he opened a line of credit. Essentially, he was using debt to pay debt. While we were still figuring out prom, Tony had already racked up 3 times the debt most of us would incur from years of college. Tony also started dating a 15-year-old girl. Questionable? Yes. Technically illegal? Maybe not. He paid a friend to tattoo his name on her lower back. The result was predictably awful. He brought his shiny new truck to our graduation after-party, got drunk, and drove home. Tragically, he crashed, killing 2 people and leaving himself with a serious brain injury. He's now serving a very long prison sentence. Last I heard, he'd beaten another inmate and was transferred to maximum security. Oh, and the 15-year-old girlfriend gave birth to his son. Story 25. A few years ago, I worked as a delivery driver. Helpers didn't last long, most were clueless. But one guy, Hamdrew, was an absolute marvel of incompetence. Hamdrew was 25, claimed to have graduated in broadcast journalism due to a clerical error, he said, and sounded like Enos from Futurama. He was pudgy, weak, and utterly unsuited for the physical demands of the job. The first time I met him, I watched him struggle to understand how to load a truck. He said he could handle it, but I could see in his eyes he was thinking about cake. For months, I babysat him as he dropped things, ran into walls, and grunted loudly, even when lifting pillows. But the pinnacle of his absurdity came one morning during a truck loading session. Hamdrew asked if he should dolly a couch onto the truck. I said yes. He asked if he should place it in the clearly padded spot. Again, yes. I turned to check some paperwork, and a few moments later I heard him call my name. I walked over to the truck, no sign of him. Confused, I asked what he wanted. His muffled voice came from behind the upright standing couch. I blocked myself in and I don't know what to do now. I'm stuck. I stared in disbelief. Just put it back on the dolly and come out the way you came in. But then how do I get the couch back in this way? At this point, I felt an anger-induced stroke coming on. My manager walked by and I pointed at the truck. He asked where Hamdrew was and I said, he's stuck. The manager laughed, thinking I was joking, but after looking inside, he realized I was dead serious. Hamdrew had wedged himself against a wall with the couch and couldn't figure out how to get out. We sat and watched as he struggled to solve this real-life Tetris puzzle for 2 or 3 minutes. Eventually, he somehow maneuvered himself free, but the entire experience remains one of the most baffling things I've ever witnessed. Before you take Hamdrew's side, remember, he'd been on the job for months. Moving furniture wasn't a new concept, yet he still managed to trap himself with a couch. It was the most surreal display of incompetence I've ever seen. Story 26. It was raining when I arrived at a friend's house with another buddy. As we got there, people were leaving and piling into a vehicle, prompting us to tag along. Without knowing what was going on, I told my buddy to hop in. While driving down the main road toward an area just outside of town, the others in the car casually mentioned they were planning to rob a Husky gas station. At that moment, I realized I was in a terrible situation and told them how stupid they were and demanded to be let out. One of the friends turned around with a knife, saying I had no choice but to be involved. I didn't know how to react, but knew they couldn't force me into being a criminal, so I just laughed. It was clear some of them were drunk or high on coke, completely out of it. My buddy, however, was all in, putting on a mask and getting ready. I stayed quiet until we got to the destination. They drove laps around the gas station before finally stopping behind it. While they got out to commit the robbery, I simply walked away. Thankfully, the friend whose house we had started at joined me, showing he had at least a bit more sense than the rest. I called another friend with a car and said, "Man, some crazy stuff just went down. I'm stranded an hour outside the city. Can you help?" That friend came through, and I got home safely. The next day, I heard about the aftermath. Half the group got ripped apart by police dogs after crashing in a cornfield. They'd driven right past the RCMP station on their way out of the city. One guy had a scholarship to Tampa Bay for rollerblade hockey, but threw it away for this stupidity. The big guy was so mauled by dogs that fat was hanging out of his wounds. Another guy got his nuts bitten. Amazingly, one guy managed to hide $1,000 in the cornfield and retrieve it later. The charges against them were dropped due to the severity of the dog attacks and the lack of video evidence. They even put the police dog down, and the group was released a month later. Moral of the story, you don't have to be a leader, but don't be a follower. Story 27. Our next-door neighbor in New Jersey owned 2 Persian kittens, a male and a female. One day, as we sat in her kitchen, I noticed the female was in heat. I warned her to keep them separated, but she said, "Oh no, that has already been taken care of." I assumed she meant the male had been neutered. 2 months later, she called me in a panic, saying something was wrong with the female. I went over to check since I was a licensed vet tech. When I arrived, the 8-month-old kitten was in active labor with a kitten stuck in the birth canal. It was trying to come out back first, so I had to turn it and help deliver it. After 4 kittens, we were done, and we sat at the table having coffee. I asked her how the female got pregnant since the male had never been outside, and she had told me he was neutered. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "Oh, Charlie isn't neutered." Confused, I reminded her that I had warned her to keep them apart, to which she had replied that it was already taken care of. I asked, "If you didn't neuter Charlie, what did you mean?" She replied, dead serious, "Well, I sat them both down and told them several times that they're brother and sister and should never mess around with each other." I thought they listened to me, but I guess not. You can't make this stuff up. Story 28. When I was 20, I worked part-time at a Midwestern hardware store, where the third assistant manager, Russ, was hands down the dumbest person I've ever met. Lazy to the extreme, Russ constantly injured himself in ridiculous ways that rendered him unable to work, leaving me to pick up the slack on many of his managerial duties. The event that finally broke me was when Russ offered me a second job at his wife's company. He explained that she was in sales and even drew a diagram on a piece of paper to show me her company's structure. At the top, he placed an X representing his wife, then 2 X's beneath her, managers, followed by 4 more X's representing salespeople. He had literally drawn a pyramid. I immediately said, "Oh, so it's a pyramid scheme." Russ got angry, crumpled up the paper, and said I was too young to understand how businesses work. That was it for me. I started planning my exit. Edit, to clarify, it wasn't hard to recognize the scheme. The diagram, combined with Russ's description, made it clear. He even mentioned that the lower-tier people would recruit their own people to manage. I wish I remembered what she was selling, but this was over a decade ago. Story 29. I once worked for a company that operated vehicles with advertisements on them. While the ads weren't the company's main product, they brought in a significant amount of revenue. One vehicle in particular was wrapped entirely in vinyl ads and made almost as much money in daily revenue as all the other vehicles combined. Unfortunately, this vehicle was a complete piece of junk. It had constant mechanical failures, and most employees refused to drive it. As the night shift supervisor, I was brainstorming ways to improve service and suggested leaving the vehicle in the shop for a few days to give the maintenance team time to fix it properly. The general manager, however, didn't see the point. He wanted to keep running it until it completely broke down, reasoning that the ad revenue would eventually cover the repair costs. I tried explaining that this approach would take months, and when the vehicle inevitably failed in the Texas heat, it would disrupt the rest of the fleet and drive passengers away. He still didn't listen. Sure enough, one hot August evening, I was driving the vehicle when the onboard computer started overheating. I had to alternate between driving a block and waiting 5-10 minutes for it to cool down. After an hour, I'd barely made it halfway back to the garage. Then it happened. I heard the loudest bang of my life. The computer exploded. I couldn't help but laugh. It was so absurd. We couldn't even tow the vehicle back with another car. I had to fetch the company tow truck, go through the slow process of getting it ready, and then tow the vehicle back to the garage, a process that took over an hour. After everything was done, I sent a status report to the GM. This vehicle's brain exploded at intersection at XX tonight. It absolutely will not be moving on its own anytime soon. Operators stayed late to help move it to the back of the shop so it won't block working vehicles. I hope that check from the ad company covers this. The GM was furious, but by that point I didn't care. The vehicle didn't get proper repairs until after he was fired. Now it's functional, but the memory of that disaster still makes me laugh. The joys of working in public transit are truly endless. Story 30. My first job out of college was as a junior developer under a guy who thought he was a tech genius. He believed modern tools like PHP, Ruby, Net, and Java were for idiots. Instead, he wrote our company's e-store backend entirely in C, and this was in the late 2000s. His genius didn't stop there. He created his own version control system. Forget Git or SVN. Those were for losers. His system? Every time he made changes, he'd save a new copy of the file, appending a number to the file name, for example, *6. By the time I left, the live version was a store C6. Not because it was the 6th iteration, but because after store C.10, he'd looped back to a store C1. His advice when I complained: just check the timestamps, dummy. The front end was a masterpiece of its own. He didn't like HTML, so the entire site was run through a monolithic JavaScript file, index.js, which loaded a series of other static JS files. It took 30 seconds to load the homepage, but it's super fast after that. But the piece de resistance was how he stored data. Mr. Genius didn't like databases, so everything was stored in JavaScript files. Inventory? That was in inventory.js user accounts, stored in passwords.js. If a user wanted an account, they had to email support. He'd reply with a password and then upload an updated passwords.js file. When I raised concerns about this approach, pointing out that a hacker could simply navigate to /passwords.js and download every user's information, his response floored me. Databases are a juicy target for hackers. Running one is like getting blood in the water. The sharks will come from miles away. But what kind of hacker has the time to scroll down to line 897 of index.js to see that passwords.js is included? I left shortly after. Story 31. I worked on new home construction sites where we often crossed paths with the same crew of guys at different stages of the build. One guy stood out, a tall, tattooed dude with a beard who acted tough and told wild stories about his time in the military. For 5 years, he regaled us with tales of running a .50 cal machine gun on Humvees, shooting enemies, and having to run over children to avoid IEDs. He claimed to live in town, was married with 3 kids, worked in real estate, owned part of a bar, and his dad was a broker at a big real estate firm. We believed him for 5 years. There was no reason to doubt him. That is, until a new guy joined the team who had actually served in the military. One day, this new guy called him out on a story that didn't make sense. Turns out everything was a lie. He had faked his military service to get the job. He wasn't married, didn't have kids, wasn't in real estate, didn't own a bar, and his dad wasn't a broker. He lived with his mom in a dingy apartment on the edge of town. He was fired immediately. A year later, I saw him outside a bar smoking cigarettes with some guys. As I walked by, I heard him telling them the same fake military stories. Some things never change. Story 32. My best friend from childhood is a great guy, but he's unbelievably dumb. Over the years, I've built an arsenal of his ridiculous antics to roast him with, including the Pokemon Roof Saga. He skipped middle school classes repeatedly to climb on top of his garage, eat stolen candy, and play Pokemon. His mom came home early from work multiple times to find him sitting on the roof. Despite this, he never thought, maybe I should pick a less obvious spot. Pyromaniac tendencies. He poured gasoline on dirt in his backyard and lit massive fires every day, creating flames 15, 20 feet high. He did this at friends' houses too, often without their permission, getting other kids in trouble while somehow always avoiding consequences himself. Kleptomania without subtlety. He'd steal hundreds of dollars worth of iPods, accessories, and chargers from Best Buy in a single trip, stuffing them into his pants and coat. Then in a genius move, he'd try to return the stolen goods for cash. Somehow he never got caught. Vehicle addiction. He's owned an absurd number of vehicles, cars, motorcycles, trucks, trading them in the moment he got bored, never fully paying them off. I'm terrified to ask how much he owes on things he doesn't even own anymore. I have more stories, but I'll stop here. It's honestly a miracle he's made it to 25. Story 33. I'm not the dumbest person I've met, but I once did something incredibly stupid. At 21, after a house party, a friend and I decided to blow our paychecks in Reno. After one beer, we left the party, walked to a car, and my friend gestured to the driver's seat, saying, "Okay, you drive." I hopped in, took the keys he handed me, and off we went. We made it to Reno by midnight, had a wild night in a seedy motel, and blew about $500 each at the casinos. By Sunday morning, we were heading back home, broke but needing to get ready for work on Monday. Halfway back, the car started underperforming. We pulled over and found the accelerator cable was kinked, so it wasn't opening the carb properly. After a quick field fix, I joked with my friend about how much a mechanic would have charged him for that repair. His response? "Me? I thought this was your car." Turns out the keys had been sitting on the dashboard when we first got in, and when he handed them to me, I didn't think twice. We had stolen a car. We drove it back into town, parked it in my garage for the day, and cleaned it thoroughly. I emptied the ashtray, wiped it down, and wrote an apology letter explaining the issue with the accelerator cable. I left a $5 poker chip from the El Dorado as a bizarre peace offering. At 3 a.m., I drove it back to where we had taken it, parked it exactly where it was, left the note and chip on the seat, and walked home. A couple of weeks later, I spotted the car again and realized we had stolen it from a girl I went to high school with. I never heard a word about it. At least she got a fixed car, a poker chip, and a strange mystery out of the ordeal. Story 34. I used to work in retail at a telecommunications company with a girl. Let's call her Jess, who had absolutely no concept of work or professionalism. Here's a quick highlight reel of her antics. Eating on the counter. Jess would openly eat her lunch on the counter where customers were supposed to be served. She'd even slice fruit with a knife right there in front of customers. Watching TV while working. She'd watch entire TV series on her phone while serving customers without pausing or even pretending to pay attention to them. ID fail. Once she failed to check ID and ended up disconnecting someone's phone service, putting their number on a random SIM card for another customer. Avoiding work. She'd go to great lengths to avoid serving customers, including hiding or pretending not to notice them. Quitting for the best reason ever. She wasn't fired. She quit because she thought everyone was too mean to her and the atmosphere wasn't for her. Bonus. Jess once failed her motorcycle test, went to remedial classes, failed those, went to scooter remedial classes, and failed that too. I didn't even know remedial classes for scooters were a thing. Story 35. My friend Jay has been obsessed with a girl for 3 years. He's confessed his feelings multiple times, and she's politely turned him down every single time. The worst was when he asked her out during lunch in front of hundreds of classmates while spinning a fidget spinner. She panicked and claimed she was dating her friend and was a lesbian. She's not. Later, Jay became convinced she secretly liked him because she put a heart next to her name in his yearbook. She does this for everyone, but he wouldn't believe me until I showed him. Now, whenever she signs yearbooks, she adds a note like, "This heart holds no declarations of love, marriage proposals, or romantic affection." Jay also tried to kidnap me at homecoming out of jealousy because I went with someone else. He and his friend attempted to pick me up and carry me away, but I elbowed him, and a friend of mine tackled him. I feel bad for him sometimes, but yikes. Story 36. I worked with a millennial client who was surprisingly clueless about technology. Let's call him Mr. Male Bimbo. I was color grading a video for him, and after uploading it to YouTube, he came back claiming the colors were different. YouTube compression had slightly altered the colors, but the difference was almost imperceptible unless you meticulously compared frames. I regraded the video to compensate and uploaded it again. The next day he said it looked different on his laptop, a MacBook Pro Retina. I explained that his laptop's display calibration was the issue, not the video. He insisted I tweak the video to match his laptop, so I reluctantly did. The following day, he claimed it looked different on his friend's MacBook Pro Retina. He then played the video on every screen in the office, noticing the variations in color across displays. In shock, he turned to me and said, "Just fix it." Story 37. I once knew someone who didn't understand how credit cards worked. At a mall, he signed up for a credit card after being asked what limit he wanted. He casually said $2,000, not knowing what it meant. He started using the card for everything, assuming it would automatically draw from his bank account. When he maxed out the card, he was shocked to learn he had to pay the money back, with interest. He admitted he hadn't read the paperwork, never checked his bank transactions, and ignored the bills in the mail. Even worse, he had multiple bank accounts because he thought it was cool to have lots of cards in his wallet, like it made him look rich. He had no idea which account had money at any given time. Story 38. In my first hands-on engineering project, I was paired with a guy who introduced himself with, "Are you good at designing and building? Because I'm not good at that. Also, are you good at writing reports? Because I'm also pretty terrible at that." Off to a great start. My other partner and I ended up designing and building the entire machine ourselves. All we asked this guy to do was decorate it since extra credit was given for style. Simple task, right? Wrong. We came back the next day to find that he had drawn a giant red Wisconsin W on the machine, in red pen, on the week Duke was playing Wisconsin in the NCAA National Championship. And to top it off, the W wasn't even colored in. My other partner and I, who hadn't slept in over 30 hours, spray painted the entire machine over with primer to hide the atrocity. Exhausted, we asked our partner to at least start the written report, hyping him up with phrases like, "You're a really eloquent writer, don't doubt yourself." He seemed motivated, walked into the back room with his laptop and shut the door. Thinking he was hard at work, we went to nap in our dorms. When we came back, his backpack was still in the shop, so we were proud of him. We even bought him chips from the vending machine. Then we opened the door. He was passed out on the floor. His laptop was open, credit for that, but it was turned off. When we woke him up, he explained that he had typed the heading, misspelled my name, and then his computer got a virus and shut down. He then promptly left, saying he was tired, leaving us with a 12-page report due the next day. Fueled by record-breaking amounts of coffee, my other partner and I finished the report ourselves, earning a B on the project and an unshakable bond of mutual respect. Story 39. A guy I work with, let's call him Brian, is easily the most clueless person I've ever met. Here are a few gems. Misusing words. Brian constantly misuses words. For example, he says things like, "Wow, you're getting offensive for no reason," when he actually means defensive. Misunderstanding space. Brian thinks a galaxy and a solar system are the same thing. No explanation seems to stick. Viking ancestry meltdown. We were talking about ancestry one day, and I mentioned my DNA test showed that most of my ancestors were from countries bordering the North Sea. I joked that my ancestors were either Vikings or stolen by them. Before I could finish, Brian interrupted, yelling, "You can't be descended from Vikings. You don't have ancestors from Denmark." When I tried to explain that Vikings came from more than just Denmark and that Scandinavia includes multiple countries, he refused to listen and shouted me down. That was the moment I decided to avoid unnecessary conversations with him. Brian is a treasure trove of confusion, but honestly, he's also a good reason to keep meetings short. Story 40. This is a love story so ridiculous it could only happen to two barely adult boys. I work at a truck stop in rural Texas, and one of my coworkers, Jim, fell in love with a guy named Chad, a total user who hadn't held a job since high school and lived off friends. Chad used Jim for a place to sleep and free stuff. In return, Jim got some booty. But Jim wanted a relationship, which Chad didn't, because he was already juggling 3 side flings with women from nearby towns. When Jim found out, he kicked Chad out. Chad came crawling back, claiming he'd realized Jim was the one and asked him to move to another state with him. Jim was almost convinced until he found out Chad was arrested for attempting to assault a 13-year-old girl. Chad's bail was set at $25,000, requiring $2,500 to post. Jim, who already had $500 car payments and no savings, took on 50-hour work weeks to save up. Meanwhile, Chad wrote love letters to one of his side girls, who eventually ghosted him after realizing he was a predator. Jim, despite all this, stayed loyal and visited Chad weekly in jail. When Chad sensed Jim's resolve weakening, he proposed to him and promised they'd leave town together when he was released. Jim believed him. Tax season rolled around, and Jim used his refund as a down payment on a payday loan to pay Chad's bail. His parents, horrified by the situation, kicked him out because they didn't want a sex offender near their home. Jim moved into an apartment he couldn't afford, taking on even more debt. Just a week after getting out, Chad left him for a couple, Anne, a new coworker, and her boyfriend Zach, Chad's best friend. Chad moved in with them to help one of them get pregnant, though it was clearly just an excuse to end things with Jim. Jim lost his car, his apartment, and his boyfriend, and now owes 6 months of back rent. Meanwhile, Chad still has 20 years hanging over his head for his charges. This whole saga is the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Jim always got what he wanted growing up, and it seems his inability to accept reality has led him here. Story 41. At my last trucking job, I worked with a teammate who treated the GPS like it was a divine being. If it told him to drive into a lake, he'd probably do it without hesitation. We had a load to deliver from Indiana to Florida. I was asleep during the pickup, and about 3 hours later, I woke up to our boss calling, furious. Turns out, my teammate had driven to the customer's facility, stopped briefly to check the load notes, and parked just close enough for the GPS to think we had arrived. The GPS marked the stop as complete and rerouted us to the next stop, a fuel station in Tennessee. Without questioning how the distance went from 50 feet to 400 miles, he followed the GPS and left without picking up the load. Our boss and the customer were livid. When I asked him why he didn't grab the load, he shrugged and said, "The GPS told me to keep going." He then tried to blame me, claiming I'd programmed the route into the GPS. If you trust a computer screen over what you can see with your own eyes, you shouldn't even be driving a car, let alone a semi-truck. Yet here he was, cruising down the highway with no load and no clue. Story 42. At university, I met a girl who initially seemed eccentric, but I eventually realized she just wasn't very bright. She was known for always wearing bright lipstick, which she applied well above her upper lip line, creating a clownish look. Combine that with her antics, and she became one of the most memorable and clueless people I've ever encountered. Here are a few highlights. First day of school. During orientation, we had to fill out personal information forms. She sat next to me with her mom, who was dictating her name and birth year letter by letter. At one point, she made a mistake and yelled at her mom for getting it wrong. It was surreal watching someone need assistance spelling their own name and then blame their mom for the error. Microbiology lab disaster. In our microbiology lab, we worked with dangerous bacteria like E. coli and MRSA. The teacher emphasized safety protocols, including staying near the flame to prevent bacteria from spreading. But this girl ignored every rule. She opened a bacterial strain, Klebsiella, couldn't identify it despite the label, and walked across the room to shove it in the teacher's face, asking what it was. The teacher was furious. Later, we were supposed to transfer bacteria from a liquid medium to agar using a micropipette. Instead, she poured the agar medium into the bacterial tube, ruining it. Then she accidentally dropped and broke the tube, spilling bacteria everywhere. The teacher finally kicked her out, and she left claiming the teacher was crazy and a bad person. The presentation fiasco. During a PowerPoint presentation, her slide text was too small for the teacher, sitting at the back of the room to read. When the teacher pointed this out, she snapped back, "It's because you're sitting back there. I'm up here, and I can see it just fine." There are more stories, but these are the ones I'll never forget. Story 43. During university, I met a girl who initially seemed eccentric, but I quickly realized she was just not the brightest. Her signature look was bright lipstick, always applied way above the contour of her upper lip. Combine that with her antics, and she became one of the most unforgettable and clueless people I've ever met. First day of school. After the opening ceremony, we had to fill out forms with our personal information. She sat next to me, with her mom present. Her mom dictated her name and birth year letter by letter while she filled out the form. At one point, she made a mistake writing her own name and started yelling at her mom for it. It was such a bizarre first impression. Microbiology lab disaster. During a microbiology class, we worked with dangerous bacteria like E. coli and MRSA. The teacher emphasized strict safety protocols, like staying near the flame to prevent airborne contamination. This girl ignored all the rules. She picked up a tube labeled Klebsiella, couldn't identify it despite the clear label, and walked across the room to shove it in the teacher's face, asking, "What is this?" The teacher was livid. Later, when transferring bacteria to agar using a micropipette, she poured the agar into the bacterial tube, ruining the sample. Then she somehow managed to break the tube, spilling bacteria on the floor. The teacher kicked her out of the lab, and she went around telling everyone that the teacher was crazy and mean. It was the most chaotic lab session I've ever seen. PowerPoint presentation. Fail. She once gave a presentation with text so small that the teacher, sitting at the back of the room, pointed out that no one could read it. Her response? "Well, that's because you're sitting far away. I'm standing here and I can see it just fine." She had a knack for creating chaos in every situation. These are just a few of the most memorable moments. Story 44. We had an employee who was completely incapable of learning anything. Every task he was given, he'd mess up. Customers outright refused to work with him, and one even dropped us as a vendor. It got so bad that my boss put him on an employee improvement program, EIP, a 90-day program involving intensive supervision and training. About a week in, the guy knocked on my boss's door and asked, "Just out of curiosity, when do I get my promotion?" My boss was stunned. Promotion? The guy was on the verge of being fired. When asked why he thought he was being promoted, the employee replied, "Well, I'm going through all this management training here in the office. Are you just waiting for a position to open up so I can take it over?" He genuinely believed the EIP was a junior management program and was thrilled to think he was being groomed for greatness. My boss, trying not to laugh, told him they'd discuss his future once the training was further along. Unsurprisingly, the employee failed to grasp even the basics and was eventually let go for incompetence. But for one glorious moment, he got to live in the delusion that he was destined for advancement. Story 45. The idiot who bought my couch this weekend wins the award for sheer stupidity. First, despite multiple warnings that he needed a trailer, he showed up with an undersized SUV. I offered to hold the couch for him until he could come back with proper transportation, but he refused. He dismantled the couch entirely, paid me, and took responsibility for any damage. Then he put part of the frame in the elevator door and walked away to grab the rest, only to be shocked when the elevator doors closed and nearly crushed the frame. When I yelled at him for being careless, he acted surprised. As predicted, the pieces didn't fit in his SUV. He had to leave half the couch behind and come back later. When he returned, he tried to pocket my tools, then admitted he had no idea how to reassemble the couch. He also tried to change his mind about the purchase, even though half the couch was already at his home, now damaged from his mishandling. He demanded a discount because he had to make 2 trips. Later that evening, he called me asking for help putting the couch back together. At that point, I told him to F off and blocked his number. This guy could have saved himself so much trouble by renting a trailer and transporting the couch properly. Instead, he went through far more effort, destroyed a perfectly good couch, and made himself look like a fool. Story 46. A former co-worker, Ashley, takes the cake for workplace incompetence. She worked at a hotel with me for a few months and managed to embarrass herself and us multiple times. The Alfredo incident. We had a regular guest named Alfredo who often pre-booked rooms even if he wasn't sure he'd arrive that day. His company reimbursed him, and he was very particular about his accommodations. Ashley decided this wasn't acceptable and rented his room to another guest despite being told not to by two co-workers. When I asked her what she'd do if Alfredo showed up, she shrugged and said, "He'll just have to deal with it." She was convinced it wouldn't be a problem to tell one of our best customers to quit complaining. She had no idea how much hotels prioritize regulars. The Squires restaurant debacle. One evening, two male guests asked for recommendations for bars with good food. My coworker Jessica advised against going to a place called Squires. They ignored her and went anyway. When they returned, one of them joked, clutching his stomach, "You were right, we shouldn't have gone to Squires." Ashley decided this was the perfect moment to say, "See, this is why men should listen to women and not dismiss our opinions because we're women. We know things. If my ex-husbands had listened more, maybe they'd still be married." She was ready to keep ranting, but Jessica wisely cut her off. Christmas party meltdown. For our Christmas party, Ashley repeatedly told the general manager that she couldn't eat red meat and demanded chicken. The catering was already set, but the GM promised to buy her a grocery store rotisserie chicken. When she arrived at the party and saw no chicken on the catering table, she freaked out, even though the GM personally handed her the chicken he'd bought. She then proceeded to interrupt speeches and presentations, laughing loudly about how drunk she was. She'd had 2 drinks. Ashley was eventually fired after picking a fight with a guest over something petty. A couple of years later, she briefly worked at a furniture store where my sister worked and was still complaining about how unfairly she'd been treated. Some people never change. Story 47. My sister-in-law takes the cake for absurdity. She's 10 years older than my brother, lost custody of her daughter, huge red flag, and had no idea how to use basic appliances despite being 55 years old when this happened. She and my brother worked at a B&B. She handled breakfasts and cleaning while he did maintenance. Early on in their job, we visited, and she had to cook bacon for breakfast. The recipe said to microwave it, but didn't specify how. Instead of taking the bacon out of the packaging, she threw the entire unopened pound in the microwave and set it for 15 minutes. As expected, the package exploded, coating the microwave with bacon grease. She then took the greasy package, tracked grease all over the floor and stove, and was about to light the gas stove to cook something else. We had to physically stop her to prevent her from igniting the entire greasy mess and burning the place down. When she cleaned up, she used some MLM cleaner that was essentially just scented water, which took forever. Another time, over breakfast, my brother mentioned how renting a bigger truck would have saved him time and money when moving our mom's stuff, especially with tolls on trailers. He noted that the extra axle on the trailer increased the toll fees. My sister-in-law's eyes widened, and she gasped, "Oh my God, that means 18-wheelers have to pay tolls on 18 axles."